last week we talked about communication and kind of an introduction into what risk assessment looks like and what we as agencies, providers, and individuals can do in order to mitigate damages, specifically around disaster management, but also in community resilience. Today we're going to be talking about, we're still talking about disaster resilience and coalition building, but we're going to be talking about the preparation phase. I'm not sure if you remember from last week, but there are multiple phases. And preparation is, as it sounds, the time before an incident, but we'll get into kind of the nitty-gritty of that. So if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to interrupt via the chat. I have that open. And apologies for any horns or angry New York sounds that you hear from my feed. So this is, I'm sure we're all familiar with this. This is a map of New Orleans. The blue lines are utilized in order to kind of split the city into grids. This came off, this is actually part of like a contraflow and like movement map. So this is used by the city to understand how to direct people and how to manage people. But this is also good for us to understand how the city views us as consumers of disaster management interventions. And it's a really interesting way of looking at things. So I wanted to preface this conversation by kind of showing you how the city views us. And, it helps us kind of understand the differences in like how we should be preparing, because again, the way the city allocates area matters a lot to what we decide to do in the preparation stage, but also in later stages, which we will discuss later. So I really like this little comic. We ask when we're talking about preparation, what does it actually mean to be prepared? How do you do it? How does your community prepare? And what are some barriers that keep people, communities, individuals from preparing in an ideal manner? So, the big question that gets asked, I think, especially in the Gulf states, especially post-Katrina, was why didn't you evacuate? And this is the number one question that comes to mind when people talk about preparation. How do you prepare to evacuate? And even with your preparation, why didn't you evacuate? So today we'll be talking about, what is preparedness? What is evacuation? And then how do these two things interact to create outcomes, whether they're good or bad? I'm not sure if you guys on the other end want to comment. Do you have any thoughts around what it means to be prepared? And you can type that in since you don't have audio. And I'll just give you a second if you want to. You don't have to participate if you're not feeling it. So I'll go ahead and let you respond if you like. I have my box open so I can see you. And then I'll reiterate it for the recording should you have any input. But one of the most important things to really think about and know about preparation is that it has a different definition for everybody, whether it's individual level, agency level, government level, federal level. And it's important to acknowledge that and also work with communities and individuals to say, hey, what does preparation mean to you? I think, I mean, doing this work, I am surprised to find different people's opinions regarding preparation and what the definition of that is. So just okay, great. So I think, when you start this conversation, whether it's with communities, whether it's with your clients, it's good to first define, what does preparation mean to you? Ashley, do you mind if I ask you what you consider preparation?
Sure. So to me, being prepared, specifically in New Orleans, which I think is unique in some compared to some other places, is one for me as a homeowner having flood insurance in the event that something happens. So making sure that financially I'm set. Also, which happens every single time there's a storm. I'm always like, oh my God, I don't have anything. I don't have any water prepared or anything stored away. So I think that just having food that is non-perishable and water set aside just in the case of emergencies is being prepared. And again, every time something happens, I always run into the issue of not having anything and never being really prepared.
No, great. Thank you so much, Ashley. And I think that actually really, it's a good place to start because that is, I think, the common perception of preparedness. I actually asked my family this recently because there was I told you last week, a brief blackout, and they realized they weren't prepared. And, my father's definition of preparedness had everything to do with financial readiness. And my mother's was like, well, 2 bottles of water and a flashlight would have been nice. So preparedness really differs across community and like personal understandings. I know that we just had Andrew and Patricia write in saying that they're here. Do you guys want to share any particular feelings around what is preparedness? Does it mean anything different to you or your agency? I know that's a lot to type, so if you wish to type it, you can do so. And again, I'll reiterate it. Let's see. Okay, so these are some examples of kind of what Ashley was touching upon. What does preparedness look like? We start from a very basic place, especially when we're talking about FEMA. A lot of people consider preparedness material items. So, have that drinking water, like Ashley was saying, having food supply, having batteries, radios, first aid kits, those sorts of things. That's a very common concept of the emergency checklist. Here's another example. I believe this is from Nola Reddy, this particular one. This expands a little bit more, kind of adds in other factors such as children. This one's a little more long-term, looking forward into like a longer, long-range disaster. They got some lighting, cleanup, children's supplies. Yeah, this is a very long list. Oops, sorry about that. But what you might notice about these for the most part is they depend a lot on physical preparedness, material preparedness. And I think what's important to kind of hit home is that agencies need to kind of consider the person as a holistic entity, that, preparedness isn't just about physical items, because we were looking at that image before where it was saying, why didn't you evacuate? You could also see, why didn't you prepare? There are financial barriers, there's personal risk assessment barriers. Some people, have a very high threshold for what they believe they can manage. So, in effect, they may not choose to prepare in a certain way. So I think there's this shift in the community, especially in disaster management, towards, stepping away a little bit from these lists that are purely material. So it's important to think in your agencies, or even as, personal agents, how far can I bring the idea of preparedness? How can I kind of transcend beyond item-based things? Because these are very dependent lists. This requires quite a lot of planning, resources, finances. Is there anything here that you see, Ashley, that you would never have thought to add to your list?
When I first took a look at this, and yes, this is from the Louisiana Emergency Preparedness Guide, I did not adequately have in my brain about like paper documents, like my kids' birth certificates and social security cards. Like I know where all of it is, but having it readily available in the event that something happened wasn't something that immediately came to me. So as I was going through some of this stuff, I was like, oh, that makes like total sense. So that's usually the biggest one for me, is like paper things. All the other stuff I think is pretty typical. I think maybe bedding is something that I probably wouldn't immediately think about either, but definitely food, money, water, and like electrical equipment or some types of tools are things that I immediately go for.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I like that you brought up the important documents. One thing about preparedness that people oddly enough forget, whether they're agencies, people who are planning to evacuate, whether it's, you and me in New Orleans, are those important documents, because that's actually something you're planning for the future. I think what agencies forget to do is remind you that, you're anticipating a return. You're anticipating a return to normal or something approximate to normal. So I think when, we go over these lists, we have to consider, is this possible? Is this reasonable? But also, what do I need for the future? And important documents is probably one of those most important ones, especially in cities like New Orleans. Things I never thought about are like, there was like an N95 mask. Like some of these get pretty intense. Let's see, there's another one. Yeah. So, and when it comes to resources, it's all about triaging your needs. For some people, this might be medicine. For some, I think we can start with the bottom up kind of approach using Maslow's hierarchy, which is a hierarchy of human needs. Food, water, shelters are at the bottom. But for some people, there are some areas that need attention that you might initially say, hey, that can wait. So it's always important to, again, define what is preparedness. What do you consider your most basic needs? And how do we triage these so that when an event occurs or should an event occur, you are as prepared as possible? So this is just a reiteration. Assembling kits is a really popular activity that agencies, especially local agencies in New Orleans, do. Creating your disaster supply kit. I know the Red Cross does one specifically geared towards children. I think it's called Packing Your Pillowcase. These are actually really good activities to do with clients or to host as an agency. One thing that's really important to know about building disaster kits is that a lot of these items are available from certain agencies for free. You can actually get Duracell to send you batteries for disaster kits. There are a couple resources online. I need to forward these to you, Ashley, but there are a couple resources online that will actually send you some very bare basics, with a limited quantity to help you assist clients in developing these kits.
Oh yeah, that would be great if you could send that along.
Yeah, I will send that. So when you're kind of planning, this really, speaks to working as an individual with your family or even as an agency. There are some basic questions that we ask, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with these. I'm sure none of these, you're living in an area that is very high risk, sees flood events and, tropical storms, threat of hurricane or actual hurricane events with a very reliable sort of season. And that's not really the case everywhere. So, going over this is important for us, but you're more veterans than some other populations. I can tell you that in New York, nobody has extra water. Everyone uses Grubhub and Postmates, and I don't think anyone has supplies in their house to manage any sort of disaster. So it's a little different for clients and people living in the coastal states. But this, again, is a reiteration of, what we should be asking ourselves at the base level, what we as agencies should be asking clients and, encouraging them to do. Is there anything here that seems out of reach for most people or anyone that you would be working with? Mm-hmm.
I know one of the things that came up with the financial sessions that Lori does is, when you think about saving for emergency gas, food, and housing and whatnot, it can become overwhelming for many people trying to anticipate saving for something as traumatic as a hurricane or having to evacuate. So making the goals very reasonable and attainable rather than like this huge lump sum at one point in time. So like instead of saying, oh, I need to save $1,000 in the event of an evacuation, like, hey, maybe I should just save $10 a week or so in order to be prepared for something like that to happen. So that's something that I know definitely came up. I think it was this week actually with the financial session.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. So that's a big one. It's a lot to ask people to save for. This is risk assessment. It's a lot to ask people to save for something that might not happen, that might not affect their particular area, even though, again, New Orleans is a unique place in which there is high incidence and high risk. So, it's not completely ridiculous to think that this is reasonable, but for people who are living paycheck to paycheck, maybe the last thing that they want to do is be worried about stocking up on water with their spare money, trying to secure their housing. It's a lot to ask, pretty much just like any particular individual or community. Another big one is this last point about rent, talking to your landlord about protecting your home from a storm. This is something, there's actually some publications that I think were released last year by Nola Reddy about how to have this conversation. and what your rights as a homeowner or renter are in the city. But this seems to be one of the most challenging things that people face is, what are my rights when something like this happens? And I actually think, Ashley, that this comes up in everybody, that this comes up in later sessions in the housing decks.
Yes, that was actually Tuesday session,
Okay.
or Wednesday session, was renters' rights and then advocating for clients. So she spoke a little bit about that yesterday as well.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, because I know when I found this out, I asked my landlord what the plan was, and there was no plan. So it's really good to kind of figure out, what do I have in my power to work with? And, what are those things that I need to know about? How do I return home? Should there be a major event?
Absolutely.
So again, we talked about crisis communication last week. And really what this comes to is not only, how do we communicate issues and risk, how do we communicate decision making? This is a really challenging topic because what you're trying to really, it's almost like a combination of all these topics we've been talking about, mental health, housing, finances. How do we communicate to people how to appropriately manage risk, but then to also make decisions? It's essentially like training for behavior. And it's not always easy. It's not always indicated with a particular population or person. But here are 3 particular areas in which we pretty much target when we're talking about, how do we affect decision making. So, crisis communication was a big one from last week. The second section is kind of, people make decisions based on what they hear, what their community is saying, the television. Very similar to crisis communication, but it doesn't always mean that the information is validated or the same. I've definitely seen things, especially in New Orleans, around disasters or crises or just like news flashes where I hear one thing from the TV, one thing from online sources like Reddit, which is a commonly used one for the city. And it can get confusing. And then finally, you have to think about like, what are the intentions of these communication models? What exactly are they kind of guiding you towards? So every disaster declaration or every decision the city makes around a disaster or a crisis, there's a specific intention on their part. And then, how does someone read that? And how does that affect their decision making? Is the trust there for them to, appropriately read that intention? So, and that kind of leads me to the next thing is, what are we actually being asked to do in order to mitigate risk in the preparedness stage? So this is like some solid knowledge that I can offer you that you can utilize to discuss with clients or, family, to think about yourselves. One of the big things that the city has typically had a challenge with consistently focusing on is contraflow. I am sure you are all familiar with contraflow. This is when all lanes of a selected roadway are converted to move people away from harm. This wasn't contraflow, but this was a poorly communicated issue that happened in the freeze was that 2 or 3 years ago? That was 2 years ago. There was that big freeze. City shut down for at least a day. They actually ended up closing portions of I-10, but did not communicate this information with anybody. And contraflow is actually surprisingly difficult to communicate, especially if people are relying specifically on TV or technology that may fail during these disasters. So this is information that is available through the city. This is kind of where that risk communication part comes in, where as an agency, you can have these materials on hand. It's always good to hand these sorts of things out and then be one of the primary communicators to talk about, which contraflow is being utilized, how is this going to work. But this is a challenge. Contraflow has been a challenge for many agencies to communicate and not necessarily enact. No matter what, contraflow is going to be really difficult for people to sit through. It tends to take very, very long. I think we've all read stories about, contraflow disasters. The most recent was out of Florida. I had a colleague that said it took 26 hours to get from Miami to, I think, just like central Georgia. So this is a big kind of, we're building on a lot of skills here, but, you know, trust building, risk communication, and then behavioral decision making. One interesting thing, you know, we're talking about the realities of this preparedness and, you know, reactionary planning, is that it costs about $750 for a New Orleanian family of 4 to evacuate to Shreveport for up to 3 days. And we know that that's definitely a minimum. That is a very conservative evaluation. You know, they tell you, you know, fill your tank 4 times. Here's how much we expect you to be paying for a night. Here's how much you're gonna be paying for meals. But unfortunately, you know, that's not always the way it works. And then if we're really gonna get into the nitty gritty of it, disaster capitalism is a thing. I think we've probably all heard about it. There is a really good book for anyone who wants to look more into that topic called Shock Doctrine. And it's about kind of how people respond in disasters and how, you know, the economy works in a post-disaster setting. So again, this is a pretty modest estimate. So whenever we're making these kind of preparedness decisions, these reactionary decisions, cost is often the thing that comes up most. And again, these are the possible contraflows out of New Orleans and evacuation routes. These maps are available through NOLA Ready. And again, it's good to have it on hand to give to clients in case that they're unable to access technological resources. Yeah, a lot of ways to go. I have not personally had to evacuate, so I've never actually tried any of these. Ashley, have you tried any of these?
I haven't had to go through contraflow here.
Okay.
It has. My husband has, and this was Gustav, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that was the first big one right after Katrina. And for him, he left early. So it was a relatively, for him, smooth transition. But again, that's someone who's relatively stable, has the means to leave early, and had the means to prepare way ahead of time, and has family who lives somewhere else. So if you're a family who lives here, don't necessarily have family somewhere else outside of the city, it's harder for you to anticipate what your journey is going to be like because you don't really know where you're headed. So it's a bit different for him, but I personally haven't had to.
Oh, well, that's good. I think the thing that you mentioned that's really important is that, yeah, preparation makes evacuation so much easier. Last minute, no one wants to be evacuating last minute. Sometimes it's a cost thing. Some people wait out the traffic. If there's one thing that I can pass on from, you know, what I've learned in the field and what I've learned from the city, is that last minute and I'm sure we all know this, last minute evacuation is rarely the way to go, but sometimes the only option. It's better than staying in many cases. But it's really challenging. Evacuation's exhausting. Some people don't have air conditioning in their car. If this is in the middle of August and you're sitting on a highway for hours and hours, it's not an appealing option. So I have one more map, and I've actually heard that the Lake Pontchartrain route is actually one of the more challenging routes because of that very long bridge. And just another example. So we pretty much have 3 main options out of the city. And this is just another thing that we threw in here because I think it's fascinating. This is an estimate of the driving times and costs. This was specifically done for the city of New Orleans, because in order to kind of give people an understanding of what they might be facing, and it's a tool for people to use if they're not sure of how much they should be saving. Again, I think that these estimates are really modest. I think $160 for a 12-hour evacuation to Alexandria is a very modest estimate. But again, this is a tool to kind of give people an idea of what they should be expecting. So maybe they can put this money aside at the bare minimum in order to get out of the city. Again, look at these evacuation times. If you have family in Dallas, Texas, you can expect to be on the road for 34 hours when it's really an 8.5-hour trip. And that estimated price is around, $185 to $370. who's to say really what that would be like? But I do recommend having these kinds of resources for people to have in their preparedness kind of training and processing, because this will help people get their minds around, what does the science say? What do the numbers say? Historically, what have people been paying to actually facilitate things like evacuation? So yeah, same thing I was saying before. I think one of the biggest barriers to everything we're talking about today in regards to preparation is cost. I'm going to send Ashley a list of resources that we can put on the back end on how to kind of mitigate these costs. There are a lot of organizations out there that will very willingly send, and again, there's a quantity limit, but free supplies. I know there's one that does MREs. They're not ideal, but there are resources out there that offer free supplies in order to mitigate these costs. Because this is a rough ask. $750 for a 3-day possible evacuation is a rough ask. We all know that some disasters last far beyond their estimated time. Some people didn't return from Katrina ever. For others, it was months. So it's always good to kind of give people an idea of what they might be facing cost-wise, since it's the biggest barrier. So I have some toolkits that I'm going to go over, and a lot of these are local. New Orleans, if anything, is exceedingly lucky to benefit from a lot of local resources. This is really uncommon, actually, when you consider the rest of the country. A lot of agencies within states handle it at the federal level, but they're not encompassing. They're not extremely detailed. I was just looking at disaster management for the state of Oklahoma. I don't know why I was doing that, but it came across it. And, it made me realize that, New Orleans, for all, what people might think about it, for its reputation in regards to disaster management, really thinks about its context. And that's actually something I think to be proud of as a city.
That's a really good point, because when North Carolina and Virginia were having their hurricane issues, I have family who lives in Virginia, and I was trying to find their preparedness guide or manual just to give them something as a resource. Nothing existed. It was super difficult to find any real compilation of resources or just strategies and things that's comparable to what we have here, because it's just not something that's common, honestly, to happen in Virginia. So people aren't really prepared for anything when it comes to huge tropical storms and even huge hurricanes. They had very little information from the federal government and state government as far as assistance and just preparation and information. So that's 100%. I agree. New Orleans definitely benefits from that, especially compared to some other states. Especially considering, I think Oklahoma just got that whole huge flooding issue recently from oh my God, a bunch of states in that area are having a huge issue with agriculture and farming, and so that a lot of stuff that got flooded out very recently.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because I actually remember that. And I believe that, so the response was so poorly understood and people were so desperate for resources that the population throttled the bandwidth of the website. Didn't it shut down?
Yes, it was unable to be loaded. Yes.
So right there is that, technological issue. People were just looking for resources. This wasn't even a situation quite yet in which, power had been interrupted. There was no grid failure. There might've been some downed trees and wind, but the technological capacity of their resources had been reached before the disaster had really struck. And one thing New Orleans does really well is it creates the opportunity to find these resources, but it also has paper resources. So this is why last week we were talking about, it's really important if you communicate with the city, you communicate with NOLA Ready, the state of Louisiana, and you ask for those resources. They'll send them to you in a big box, and maybe even creating it as part of an intake packet or some kind of session is deeply helpful, because for a lot of states, like Virginia, Oklahoma, states that are under-resourced or also not very experienced with disaster, but will be experiencing more just due to climate change and other factors, they're not going to have these resources, and they're going to have a lot of catching up to do very suddenly. So thank you so much for sharing that, Ashley. I actually forgot that had happened, and that was it was kind of eye-opening for, I think, the state.
It's very scary.
It is. So yeah, paper resources. I'm a big fan of paper resources. So where you can get these resources, NOLA Ready, they just started a new division that is preparing to even more deeply speak to these issues. Ashley, why I'm blanking on the name of it. It's the one that Miss Darwesh is working with. Do you remember?
I don't.
Yeah, well, she'll look it up. But they're really expanding their reach because they understand what we were just talking about, that, you know, the Office of Homeland Security Emergency Preparedness, you know, they understand that they're doing a great job with NOLA Ready, they're doing a good job with outreach, but they want to cover every contextual possibility and reach every community possible. So they've created a whole nother section, and NOLA Ready is the primary one. This is where you get like all those resources, all that information. And again, all of this is available on paper, but we're gonna go through kind of what they have on the web first. So here's what they have information about. Again, New Orleans is really unique. This is not usually what especially Homeland Security's emergency management services per state or city look like. But we have so many specific threats and disasters that the city does actually have plans and resources for each of these things. You know, winter weather, very unique here, very, very different than the winter weather of the Northeast. So it's tailored to that. You know, the possibility of tornadoes, which was added very close to the time in which the tornadoes in New Orleans East struck. Mosquito-borne disease, that's predominantly speaking to the Zika threat. There were cases of Zika in New Orleans within the mosquito population. So the best thing that I can say about New Orleans is that it's reactive. It's prepared, it's reactive, and it is actually developing materials that will suit us and our clients. We also have resources for pet owners and seniors and people with medical needs. Again, that's really rare in this field to have that readily available. So again, this is kind of like the basic spread of the website. Really good thing about it is that you can translate this into pretty much any language. It's very responsive and actually does translate the whole page, not just the text. That's a really important, I think, piece of NOLA Ready. So we got all these. Stay connected. That is where you can kind of, you know, sign up for alerts. I really do recommend getting these alerts. I get NOLA Ready alerts, and I know we were talking a little bit about them last week, but they do keep you up to date. There was a question that came up last week about sometimes validity and like the realities of threat. So that is something that, you know, these agencies work on, you know, assessing how much should we be telling people, you know, how big of a threat is this? But that's part of a risk assessment. That's a really complicated process. Plans for emergencies, or plan for emergencies. This is a tool that guides people, whether it's agency or individual, to, you know, plan. It doesn't go into depth about what does planning mean to me, because it truly means something different to everybody. But it, at the very least, can help you when you've identified particular areas of need or interest. It can give you those resources. Again, emergency alerts. I find these immensely helpful. Some people don't like getting these, and it's completely reasonable because some people have a lot of trauma or fear around being reminded that either you're in hurricane season or that, you know, you don't always need to know every time a gutter is overflowing. I like to know, but this is a really fantastic resource, and it's quite well run. If you ever have the opportunity as an agency or individual to visit the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness in New Orleans, I highly recommend it. They do welcome agencies in to see their command centers, and the way that they manage this is extremely impressive. Again, for a city. Not every city in the United States has this. New Orleans has actually a very unique way of managing its emergency alert system, specifically around disasters. So if you can make a trip out there, I highly recommend it. Easy sign up. Oh, am I going backwards? No, there we go. We talked about this last week too, but I wanted to reiterate it because we were talking about preparedness and evacuation. Locating an evacuation spot or helping a client locate an evacuation spot is extremely helpful. Not everyone may need the assistance of the city in their preparation plans, but it's always good to know what your options are. City-assisted evacuation is, again, assisted by the city, but that also suggests that you lose some autonomy. You have to really plan with, your pet care. There is more planning to do with this than there is to do with kind of your own personal evacuation. But they do this website as well as Evacueteers website, who runs the city-assisted evacuation. They guide you through the entire process. It's a wonderful resource, and it's a really good intake question if you're specifically gearing your intake towards, resources, disaster planning. Yep. Oh, and here we have the guides. I mentioned last week that they have them in multiple languages. There's a video that's worth showing, I think, clients or even running in a waiting room setting. Another special thing about New Orleans is that there's a special needs registry. This is a really fantastic resource. It lets you know, at first it puts you on a list of people. Some people might actually not appreciate that particular feature, but it allows the state and city to prepare to deliver care to you in a specific way. So if you need oxygen, if you have a family member who's on dialysis, this is the service that will allow your evacuation or, a client's evacuation be managed, but also addresses your needs. These needs in general in the disaster field are some of the most poorly met needs in the entire field. There's a whole field of study around, how do we manage oncology? How do we manage people on insulin? Insulin requires refrigeration, not freezing, refrigeration. And NOLA Ready has actually gone through these kind of thought processes and developed ways to ensure that this is as easy as it can be, even though this is massively challenging. So, guiding clients to these resources who have needs is extremely important. Another tool, live traffic reportings and street floodings. This is something more that you would check on online. I don't believe they have an app for this yet. This is, again, for someone who maybe is just very interested in keeping up to date. But it also kind of helps you understand, what roads are impassable. I wouldn't say that this is the best resource for an active disaster, active hurricane, or an impending disaster, mainly because it requires you to sit either at a laptop or use your phone, which might take up data. But this is good for general, just taking a look at it and getting an idea of how the city responds, manages, and tracks these things. Again, if you can visit Homeland, it's really incredible. And then the seasonal preparedness, it's a newsletter. This is a newsletter that kind of just sends you information throughout the year. Also responds to specific incidences and disasters. Again, when Zika happened, or when Zika was really kind of in the news, it's still happening, but when it was really, I guess, a popular topic, they sent out information about, management of gardens, management of standing water. It actually kicked off an initiative to fill certain potholes, not all potholes. We know that those are, for the most part, going to be there forever. But NOLA Ready was a big part of helping people prepare for, mosquito-borne illnesses, which again is very impressive. This is not a common activity in most cities. So other services it offers, they do trainings. I highly recommend, if there is an area of need within your organization that is specific to the context within which you work, that you contact them and say hey, what kind of trainings can we work on together? They also help train volunteers. They're really fantastic over there, and they're super eager to get involved in the community and to assist agencies with their mission statements while honoring kind of disaster management and planning needs. They also have a past incident archive. This is super fascinating. I recommend it as just like an interesting read. They talk a lot about green infrastructure. They have things like adopting a gutter in which you can, or a catch basin, gutter, been in New York too long. So yeah, cleaning out catch basins, how to manage your lawn, again, doing kind of mosquito management. There's a lot of really interesting initiatives that they've partnered with and also offer either through like texts and things like that that help you develop and improve your green infrastructure. And then community organizations. They do some community organizing. And again, I recommend signing up for their newsletter to see what they've got going on, because they really are doing their best to respond to the needs of New Orleans. So the other thing I wanted to look at is not New Orleans specific, but I'm sure is very familiar. There is a SAMHSA office, I believe it's off St. Charles. Am I right on that, Ashley? Is it off St. Charles?
I'm not sure. I don't know if you're thinking about NAMI. NAMI is close to St. Charles, but I'm not sure.
It is. It might actually be like with NAMI. There's a SAMHSA office in New Orleans. I believe it's in the Garden District near NAMI. But they have excellent resources specifically around, helping not only, survivors of disasters, but those who are going to be responding on behalf of those populations. I really recommend, we're going to talk a bit about specifically disaster, but looking at them as a resource for just general practice. So they have something called the Behavioral Health Disaster Response app. I have this app. It's really incredible. It is probably the most, where'd I go? One of the most well integrated and developed apps as it relates to mental health and the intersectionality of disaster. Things that are typically run federally or by agencies like FEMA are very focused on recovery. There, of course, is preparedness initiatives within those kinds of agencies, but there is a lack, I would say there is a lack of recognition on the side of things like FEMA or government response that is lacking in mental health. This specifically recognizes that disasters are traumatizing, or they have the potential to be traumatizing. Not everyone comes out of a disaster with negative mental health sequelae, but SAMHSA is there for you in order to anticipate, any issues that surround depression, anxiety, PTSD, or just general trauma, both within the population you're working with and your responders. So using SAMHSA it's really easy. These are kind of the areas that they speak to. So they give you, be ready. They give you resources to pair with your planning. So these aren't just like, be ready, get your batteries. This is be ready to engage with a traumatic event as well as people who potentially are traumatized. The resources, again, are incredible. They have pocket guides, and it teaches you how to talk to people, kind of some phrases that, might mitigate conflict or mitigate stress. Really recommend printing these kind of resources out and having them on hand just in case you're a responding agency. Again, the rest here we've talked about, be prepared, be confident. And then there's a very easy way. They have like an internal messaging system that allows you to send information in the event of a disaster. Again, one of the issues with this though is that it is dependent on data and cell service. So I recommend investing in their paper materials. Briefly, because I want to save some time just in case for questions, but briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the telephone-based resources, and I'm sure we all know about these, but some people don't. There are several hotlines set up. There's really 3 numbers that we can depend on when it comes to disaster and preparedness. It is hard to say the operational capacity of these resources in the midst of a disaster, but these resources are incredible, especially in the preparedness space. So we have 211, which is for non-emergency information, 311, which is for non-emergency service requests, and then of course 911. I'm not going to go over 911 because I think we all know what 911 is for. But 311 is specifically for kind of what's listed here. I don't think it would benefit you for me to repeat it. But a lot of people don't know this service exists. This service wasn't working actually in the 9th Ward, I believe the upper 9th, for a couple of years. And it was recently found that was due to a faulty cell tower. So that is actually up and running now. But this is a really good resource to kind of manage your property, as well as make any of those health-related requests that may be related to special needs for evacuation. Again, they've put a lot of this stuff online now, which is really useful. So you can kind of get past the use of the phone service, but also it's dependent on online access. But a lot of people surprisingly don't know, even residents don't know that 311 exists. 211 is specifically for non-emergency information, but they do, in the event of a disaster, assist in obtaining emergency information. I'm actually a big fan of 211, and they're Louisiana specific. This isn't just something that New Orleans has, but they can assist people in various capacities, as well as communities and agencies. So this is something that definitely agencies and clients should be aware of, and they have plenty of online resources. It is often used as a crisis tool. I know that 211 is heavily communicated with during disaster situations in New Orleans. The Department of Homeland Security communicates very frequently with 211 and also helps train and collect data with 211. But they're quite useful. They're very fast, and they also have some very good resources that I recommend looking into. And they can sometimes assist clients with specific issues that you might not have the capacity to respond to. So just my last 2 slides are very just basic information, kind of suggestions. We can add these links to the back end to make it easier so you don't have to go back and kind of look for them. But SAMHSA has webinars that are presented by the Disaster Technical Assistance Center. They're really good for understanding how do we communicate with people around mental health, how do we honor mental health as responders, and also how do we kind of draw those lines as caregivers, because essentially disaster responders are caregivers who are also operating as disaster survivors often enough, especially when it's coming from Native leadership. Highly recommend these, really useful. And then they also have webinars that are geared towards families and children. And then this document I just added in here. Again, we'll put a link in here, but it's a really good, sorry, the sirens, a really good kind of tip guide for talking to especially the youth around disaster and traumatic events. I know that they're going to be updating this. This is a 2012 version, but they're working on updating this. And I think what they're adding to it is actually terrorism and school shootings. And then my last slide, this is kind of a culmination of everything we've talked about and some links that you should just keep in a folder on everyone's laptops or computers at work. These are the things that you need to know about the city and kind of how they're going to respond. I do have a couple, that's not related to the city. American Red Cross, United Way, these are separate agencies, obviously nonprofit. And they have their own kind of resources, but these are definitely some basic websites that everyone should have available to them in the event of a disaster or in your planning stages. Again, having anything that these agencies will give you on paper is extremely beneficial. Just, I think it's unreasonable to expect, cell towers to be completely intact. Data is expensive. It's not always accessible. You can be in a basement and, that data is no longer working. So offering clients any of these materials on paper, whether, they don't have to take it, but it's always extremely useful to have. And yeah, before I close, I just wanted to reiterate that, New Orleans is a high risk area, but the city, if anything, when it comes to preparedness, has a lot of planning and a lot of resources available, and that definitely makes it special. So that's it for specifically talking about preparedness. Does anyone have any questions? I know that we have Habitat on chat. Or does anyone have any comments about this particular material and how it ties in with everything we've been talking about this week?
Not really a question, more so of a statement, but if anyone would be interested, I know in Gentilly, excuse me, they're having a neighborhood leaders roundtable around hurricane preparedness and blight remediation. And that's going to be taking place at 2100 Leon C. Simon Boulevard or Drive, which is the New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. It's the office for that, but it's going to be around hurricane preparedness and blight remediation.
That's fantastic. I think New Orleans, out of all the cities I've worked and lived in, specifically paying attention to disaster management, has some of the most mitigatory options.
Mm-hmm.
Blight management as it relates to disaster, that's what it's on in Gentilly?
It's basically, it was something that was sent out to the New Orleans East Neighborhood Association as a way for folks to kind of be able to talk with one another in like this leadership roundtable around hurricane preparedness as we are on the brink of, hitting that climax area, but also just blight remediation because it's a huge issue in New Orleans East and I guess some parts of Gentilly too. And so that'll be this Saturday from 8:30 to 11 a.m.
Great. Thank you so much.
Or next Saturday, rather. Next Saturday. This Saturday is something else.
Next Saturday.
Yes.
Okay, great. Any thoughts from our friends at Habitat? I think maybe we're good then. Oop. There we go.
All right. Well, thanks, Jen. And thank you guys for tuning in. And then we will meet back, I guess, on Tuesday with financial planning with Lori again. So again, if you check out the website with all the recordings, there's a post on the side for like additional resources where you can access some of these links that are being mentioned throughout the PowerPoint sessions. I usually update those as I update the session. So just keep an eye on that. And other than that, I will see you guys on Tuesday. So have a good weekend.
Great. Thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome.